let's talk about this Druid problem that we're dealing with right now. First of all, here are the cards that are immediately evident as big problems. Kael'thas, Lightning Bloom, Guardian Animals, and Overgrowth, especially if you cheat it out with Nature Studies, right? So the stats back this up. These consistently show up as the top win rate cards in most variations of the deck. I only say most because some don't run Kael'thas, so can't very well be there, can he? Kel and Overgrowth are nothing new, so I feel like this expansion was kind of expecting this archetype to be around, but it just feels so much worse. Just so much worse now, which I can only assume is because of the new cards. So let's start there. Lightning Bloom is first up. Here's what you can do with Lightning Bloom. You can cheat out Kael'thas, and then play another cheap spell to cheat out a big spell. You can cheat out Overgrowth, and then ignore the Overload because you just gained 2 mana. This is hands down the most valuable option. Or you can cheat out Guardian Animals because, you're missing those other 2 pieces, but that is still really powerful. Getting 2 5-drops on 5, basically no punish, right? Things you can do without Lightning Bloom. Die to aggro, I guess. You're really not in good shape if you don't get this card. So you probably heard all about this during pre-release. I feel like a lot of big creators were talking about it, and it was one of those things where, people were divided initially, but then once people brought up this point, everyone kind of switched to this side, right? Essentially, the overload doesn't matter, because Overgrowth directly counters it by giving you those mana back, and Kael'thas indirectly counters it by allowing you to cheat out mana instead. And Animal Guardians seems kind of reasonable when you think about it in those terms, but I'd say it still has some pretty major problems of its own. So, pros of Animal Guardians, you get 7 mana to summon 2 strong 5-drops with Rush. Twilight Runner by itself is a great card. This just makes it unstoppable, right? Cons, you kind of have to limit yourself for those 5-drops, right? They're a deck building restriction. They really are, because they're generally not that good. I said Twilight Runner is really good. The other 2 that you would run, Teacher's Pet and the new Thresher, are okay. They're actually kind of lame, honestly. And if you draw them, they're basically worthless. You will not want to play them. They are dead cards in hand, almost no matter what. And if you draw all but one of them, your Guardian Animals is useless. If you draw down to 2, one of your copies of Guardian Animals is useless. It doesn't matter anymore. And honestly, I think Guardian Animals would be a little too slow if it weren't enabled by Kael'thas and Lightning Bloom. And you have to have, I think, one or the other, it would be okay. Both makes it really strong. Neither makes it unplayable, right? So I feel like this is another case of the downside not really being enough, right? Like Lightning Bloom, the downside isn't really enough to warrant not cheating out big things with it, right? Especially with Kael'thas. So if you manage to play this on 5, especially if it's cheated out by Kael'thas, this is a huge problem, right? Because you didn't just get a 4/7 from Kael'thas, you got 2 big beasts with Rush as well, right? There are basically no decks that can effectively deal with this. More on that later. So let's now talk about what my proposed changes are. For Guardian Animals, and this is in order of likelihood of how likely I think they are to actually happen, based on what I think about Blizzard and how they tend to nerf cards. So number 1 is Guardian Animals. Simply remove the Rush, right? My thinking is that changing the cost doesn't affect how it interacts with Kael'thas. It does push back that Lightning Bloom cheat, which is nice, probably necessary. But I find that less likely because they've kind of moved away from just simply get rid of its cost, lower its cost, raise its cost, whatever, right? They've gotten more nuanced with their approach to nerfs nowadays. So I think removing the Rush is the most likely. Shortly behind that is increasing the cost to 8. And I really don't think they would touch the cost of like what beasts it can summon. For example, reducing it to 4-drops instead of 5-drops. Because they printed these 5-drops basically so they could work with this spell. They're not going to just like nerf those 5-drops into oblivion because they aren't really that good just because this spell is too strong. I don't think that would happen. Besides, like, yeah, you'd still be able to cheat out Mana Saber, for example, but like, it's not, I don't think that would be that good. Yeah. I mean, we'll see if that happens, but anyway, next up, Lightning Bloom. The proposed change, and I must admit this was not an original idea. The proposed change I saw on Twitter, I wish I could remember who said it, was to refresh 2 mana crystals and change the overload to 1 instead of 2. So this still works with Kael'thas, but it doesn't cheat Kael'thas out. It also can't cheat guardian animals out. And the most important part, I think, is that it maintains the card's flavor, right? It still keeps the overload for that shaman aspect, and it still gives you ramp for that druid aspect, and the sort of idea of like refreshing mana crystals is very druid, but also a little shaman, right? I think that this would work very effectively. And I think you could take this nerf alone and it would fix everything. It would bring the power level of the swing of this deck down enough that everything else would be good. I find the Kael'thas nerf the least likely because of a few things. One, it was nerfed before. We don't like so much to continually nerf single cards, no matter how problematic their design space is. Further, nerfing Kael'thas really doesn't do that much. It just delays the time that you can cheat out your other big things, right? So instead of hitting Kael'thas, why don't you just reduce the effectiveness of those things that he's cheating out, right? This, of course, I don't think, for similar reasons, I don't think Overflow will be touched, and I don't think the other one, the other new one, the 10 Survival of the Fittest, I don't think that'll be touched. That could be reduced to a 3/3, but I find that even less likely. The biggest thing, I think, is that Kael'thas isn't new. These other things are new, right? So they've been kind of thinking about Kael'thas for a much longer time. So if they were unhappy with how he was, they would have nerfed him already, and they did. So, it's a little circular there. But I think the most likely nerf, if it were to happen, which I doubt, would be to make every third spell cost 1. And that, in conjunction with the Lightning Bloom change, so it's refresh 2 crystals, that would be really interesting. And I think that would add a lot of strategy to how you use Kael'thas plus Lightning Bloom. And honestly, you might be able to bring Kael'thas back down to a 6-drop if you do that. Maybe that's wishful, but I don't know. The other thing is, and you would only do one of these, of course, you just nerfed 8 mana. Whatever. I don't like that. I really don't like that. Again, super unlikely they'll touch Kel, but it could happen. Now, this might come as a shock based on what I've said about the deck so far, but I actually don't think it's overpowered. But it still needs a nerf. Okay? So the short answer is, it's still anti-fun. And I think that's not always more important, but definitely, in this case, more important than the fact that this isn't overpowered. Right? Here's why it's anti-fun. Your opening hand determines your win rate way too much. Now, to an extent, this is true of all decks, because that's just how card games work. But let's look at these stats here. So you can see that those problem cards, if you have them in your opening hand, you have an absurdly high win rate. And in fact, if you have these big, fat 7-drops in your hand, those are the high win rate cards. That shouldn't be the case, right? Similarly, if you look down at the other end of it, you see that you have, if you draw your beasts, you have about a 50-50 to lose the game. Because you weaken your guardian animals and you weaken your opening hand so much. You lower the chance of actually getting something worth playing, right? And again, that's kind of true of most decks, but it's usually not this polarized. It's usually not like 70% chance to win if you get this, 50% chance to win if you get this. That is ridiculous, right? And that's not even accounting for the fact that you're going to mulligan in a smart way. You're going to keep cards that go with each other, right? You always keep Overgrowth, but maybe you don't keep Kael'thas without activators, or you don't keep activators without Kael'thas, right? That sort of thing, right? So there's a lot going into this that makes these cards stronger if you know what you're doing, right? These are all average case scenarios. They're average value with the mulligan, right? So the end result of this is that games are determined on turn 0 a lot of the time. Way too much of the time. That is probably the worst design in the game. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes your opponent just gets an amazing opening against you. This deck can pull it off way too consistently. But here's why it's not OP. So if you actually look at these stats, the general win rate stats here, this is what I'd expect for a tier 1 deck. You mostly see mid to high 50s, average win rate is around 55+%, usually pretty well below 60%. But there are some exceptional pilots or lists that are able to take it up over 60%. If you compare this to Paladin, which is definitely the dominant force in the meta right now, it has a far, far higher win rate. That is, Paladin has a far, far higher win rate than anything else. Paladin is consistently over 60% in the majority of cases. There are huge decks that have these high win rates. But you have to consider, Paladin is a counter to Druid. So Paladin kind of does poorly against these more hyper aggro decks. It takes like just too long to get off online, usually a turn or two too late, right? So without Druid, the best deck in the meta goes away. And that's the nature of these early metas, too. I mean, we're still in the settling phase here, right? But these first dominant forces seem like they might try to stick around. And I'll be concerned if we keep seeing Paladin weeks from now in, a theoretical post-Druid nerf world. But otherwise, it's week 1. You sort of have to go by what's fun more than what's balanced because, well, the balance is still shifting. But the fact of the matter is, this matchup will never be fun. And that about covers it. Any comments, especially those calling me an idiot, are welcome down below. Make sure you subscribe and leave a like, and check out my Twitch. I'm live every weekday morning, playing the new expansion, of course, and we'd love to have you there. See you all then, and have a good day.